Micky, Malka, Jeremy Liew, and Hemant Taneja. Over to you.
One, two.
Should be on.
Can you hear me? Hey, everyone. Too bad we didn't have shots to take every time someone says Bitcoin. That would be animating. So that was a great intro to this panel. Clearly, the future is bright, and there's a lot going on for Bitcoin. The question is, how do we go from today's situation where you have the largest exchange being bust and a lot of mess and noise in the ecosystem and build that bright future? So what we're going to do today is start with having everyone introduce themselves and the investment they have made in the Bitcoin space. And if you can sort of share with us what you were thinking when you invested and whether that thesis has changed. So I'm Jeff Clavier, I'm the moderator, managing director of SoftTech VC. And for once, we actually haven't invested in anything in Bitcoin yet, so we'll be the skeptic on the panel. Micky.
Hi. My name is Micky Malka. I run Ribbit Capital. We're a fund focused on consumer financial services. Our tagline is, it takes money to change money. And that's what we do. That's the only thing we focus on. We are investors in 5 different Bitcoin companies. Some of the brands that you all know, from Coinbase to Sapo to BTC Jam to Pantera, who just announced the largest currency fund around Bitcoins. And we've been working and interacting with Bitcoins, and we own Bitcoins too. We've been working and interacting with Bitcoins for over 2 years now.
So when you invested, how much was the Bitcoin worth?
The first time I bought my first Bitcoin, they were worth $9, $10.
OK. That was early. So take one example of a company and the less obvious one, and what was the thesis that you had when you invested in that company?
The thesis is, for me, is the same around Bitcoin. I think it's the most disruptive thing I've seen in my life. I've been an entrepreneur in financial services for 20 years. I've built 4 different companies and never saw an opportunity like this to disrupt the system the way we know it. And what we were looking for, which is what we still look for, are companies who are building brands that consumers can trust. Because the only way to make this ecosystem grow and to get there is to get more and more millions of people to find value from it. And for that, we need to find trust. So Coinbase was a natural for us because it was the brand that we all have gotten to trust in the US over the last year as a way to experience Bitcoin in an easy form factor. The same thing has happened with Sapo. You needed a brand that you can trust to custody your coins and feel that you got insurance around it. And each one of our cases, it's the same exact thesis. We find they haven't changed. I think, if any, it's probably gone faster than I thought. But there's a lot of challenges out there. This is still an experiment where there's more than 50% chance of failing. So we cannot forget that, and we need the ecosystem to keep growing.
And you have invested in Bitcoins directly from your fund.
Yes.
Is there a set percentage that you target for the currency or the Bitcoin itself versus startups?
No. When we started to look at Bitcoins a couple years ago, or 18 months ago, seriously to invest, there were no backable companies. There were no backable entrepreneurs, and we had conviction on it. So our best way to show our conviction and to show that we wanted to participate in this was by buying the Bitcoins itself. So as a fund, we went out and we bought a position. We showed not only that we understood this, but we were actually putting our money to work, and we were taking a defensive and also an offensive position on understanding where this could go.
And just on that, you have a top-tier return on paper.
On paper.
On paper.
Yes.
Jeremy, Lightspeed.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Liew. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. We invest up and down the IT stack from semiconductors through to consumer. On the Bitcoin side, our investments include BTC China, NYBX. We're investors in Ripple Labs, which is also in the math-based currency space. We're investors in Ribbit, as well as in the Boost Bitcoin Accelerator Fund. So a number, I think 7 companies from the Bitcoin Boost Accelerator. And we're also investors in CoinLab. And so I think that might be an interesting one because we know sort of a lot of the successful companies,
Yep.
but CoinLab was a company which was set up to be the U.S. arm of a Bitcoin exchange with a back-end liquidity pool being Gox. That's an example where I think, we were right on the opportunity for exchanges, we were right on the liquidity, but as it ended up, CoinLab and Mt. Gox ended up falling apart on their business arrangements, suing each other, and then, with Mt. Gox's failure. So that is a company that we are no longer investors in.
We'll talk about the risk of investing in Bitcoin and how we investors can actually apply our fiduciary responsibility towards our investors and still get in the space. Talk to us about Ripple. So it's a cryptocurrency infrastructure, but it's an alternative to Bitcoin. So what was your thinking in investing in this? And was it a case of backing a repeat entrepreneur in fintech, or was it really because you believe in that alternative?
I think when we invested in Ripple, it was I think that Mickey's right. 18 months ago, it was very difficult to find backable teams in the Bitcoin space, and what we saw in Ripple was a team that had a repeat entrepreneur on the financial services side, and a guy who'd been spending a lot of time on the technology side, the original owner and founder of Gox. As the two co-founders there, so a lot of credibility, a lot of experience, and I think we agree with Micky that trust is going to be a very important factor for companies in the Bitcoin space to be able to grow over time. And we saw in this repeat entrepreneur in Chris Larsen, a guy who had credibility with regulators, which we think is going to be increasingly important over time. And it was, I think, an interesting differentiated approach to math-based currencies than the one that Bitcoin was taking. In a lot of ways, it is the original app coin business model that Balaji was talking about, and so we thought that was a very interesting approach. Obviously, it's still much earlier for Ripple than it is for Bitcoin, and so the network effects that have spun up around Bitcoin are still developing around Ripple, and we'll see how it continues to grow.
Cool. Hemant?
Hi, my name is Hemant Taneja. I'm with General Catalyst. We are also an early-stage venture capital firm, Palo Alto in Cambridge in New York. So we made one investment in Bitcoin, which is Circle, and it's essentially a platform that's working on providing software and tools for consumers as well as merchants. And we led the Series A in that company. And I think the two reasons we made that investment, one was less about the Bitcoin theme for us, more about the focus on creating a level playing field for small, medium businesses. Those kinds of tools that can give them the same sophistication that large companies have, especially when it comes to financial and payment systems that they can't afford to invest in. I think Bitcoin, think about what this currency is and the whole model can provide. It's sort of a level playing field in that regard. And the second was the fact that it was Jeremy Allaire. He's a guy who's built 2 platform companies before in different markets. And it was refreshing for us to see just the seriousness of the entrepreneurs that are getting into space. I was speaking to a few of you outside as well. I think the space is getting serious, and so we're starting to be more active on saying, maybe we ought to think about building a portfolio here.
Cool. So how many of you are building a startup in the Bitcoin space hoping to raise money at this conference? Or after this conference? Show of hands. Okay, don't be shy. They won't remember you anyway. We can't see anything. Okay. So lots of entrepreneurs raising capital for their startup. We see a lot of exchanges focused on security. We see a lot of mining gear. I'm not sure why mining gear are very popular these days, but I got 2 or 3 just this week. You see a lot of the build up the stack and infrastructure in Bitcoin, which I think is definitely interesting. What is it that you guys are looking for these days? And is it still skewed towards second time or sort of celebrity entrepreneurs? Or is it, hey, this young team sort of makes sense, let's go for it? Micky?
So
listen to what they say, because you will be played at when you pitch them.
We're looking for people or entrepreneurs who are building user cases around the protocol. We think that there are good companies out there trying to get people into Bitcoins and trying to understand what to do with it, but there's not user cases. We haven't seen the killer user app come out. I'm from Venezuela. Right now, I can tell you there's 5 different exchange rates if you want to get money out of the country. There's 5 different ones, from the black market to the official one that you can get $1. So there is a store of value concept for many countries around the world as a way to interact with Bitcoins. We want to see user cases. We want to see companies who are understanding who's their customer, what can they offer to them, and what is the best solution that they can provide, and use the protocol. As an example, our last investment out of this, the ones that we've done, is a company that it's trying to build the first peer-to-peer lending network in the world. Basically, using Bitcoin. It's BTC Jam. And anybody in the world can come up and ask for a loan, and anybody in the world can come up and invest in a loan. And they can do it in Satoshi units, or they can do it in Bitcoins. And it's the first time that happens.
So lending club in Bitcoin worldwide.
It's a lending club run over Bitcoin, so it's not in Bitcoins. It's using the protocol as a way to transfer and to settle, and use the blockchain to settle and to keep reconciliation of transactions. So those are user cases that we would like to see, because as they more come to bread, more users will find useful the Bitcoin's protocol to enable it and to embrace it.
Jeremy, you've done BTC China. So do you see non-US opportunities that you're going specifically after in the Bitcoin space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the financial services, there are issues in the US, but it's not fundamentally broken. Like, we have a reasonably well-functioning financial services industry here. Payments are not cheap. They're not free, but they're relatively cheap, and they're relatively easy to do, and there's very widespread adoption of digital payments of various sorts, typically credit cards and debit cards and so forth. And by and large, most Americans have reasonable faith in the stability of the US dollar as a store of value. So those two things are just true here in the US, and when you leave the shores of the US, you don't have to go very far to find places where neither of those things are true. Mm-hmm. So in China, for instance, 65% of e-commerce transactions are settled cash on delivery. So just stop and think about that for a second. I mean, that's a shocking number, 65% of transactions. So a guy puts your package in a bicycle, and he rides to your house, and he knocks on your door, and he delivers you the package, and then you decide whether or not you're going to pay him at that point. So as you can imagine, return rates and the logistics costs for that are much, much higher in that sort of environment. And it's 35% in India, and I'm not sure of the exact number in Russia. But
unbanked, lack of credit cards. What's the reason for this?
Yeah, it is fundamentally a lack of access to digital payment mechanisms, which historically has been credit cards in the U.S., which has been driven by credit, right? But there's 2 separate ideas: credit and digital transactions, digital payment. These have been conflated, and there's no reason for that to be the case in the developing world. And so I think, as you look at, just in the same way that, the developing world has leapfrogged over fixed line wireless to go directly to mobile wireless, I think that there's an opportunity for the developing world to leap over credit cards and directly go to a digital currency of some sort, with Bitcoin being the best candidate for that in the developing world. So I think that that's certainly true on the payment side. And then to Micky's point on a store of value side, a lot of people have said that Bitcoin is not a very suitable store of value because of its volatility. Mm-hmm. And if your alternative is a relatively stable currency like the US dollar, that's probably true. But if your alternative is a currency that's wildly unstable and primarily going downwards because you're in an economy in crisis, because there's rampant inflation, or because, I don't know, your country has widespread civil unrest, then then volatility that can go in both directions is actually preferable to volatility that's primarily
which
going
hasn't
downwards.
Been so bad over the last, couple of months. Once GOG essentially got...
Sure, but I mean, even when there was a lot of volatility, that alternative relative to a fiat currency that is going to be trending downward over time and relatively quickly looks pretty good. So I think that that's one area where we think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity. And then the third one is around microtransactions, and that's been discussed at length. But I do think that it's important to kind of emphasize Micky's point about use cases and actually solving real problems being the key drivers to adoption for Bitcoin.
I was going to get back on that. Hemant, you mentioned that you wanted to build a portfolio. Any sort of clues as to where in the stack you're mining for opportunities?
Yeah. So our view is it's pretty obvious, but it's a very highly regulated sector, and I think taking the approach of just a technology-centric view is not how we're going to be able to move the ecosystem along. So one of the things we're always looking for is just companies and entrepreneurs that understand that the real magic here is going to be at the intersection of technology, policy, and finance, and making sure as you're building your businesses, you're bringing that ecosystem along. So that's just sort of the DNA and the characteristic of teams that we look at. So Jeremy, for example, that's a huge part of his thesis, and he's spending time making sure he's bringing the regulators along as well. In terms of the infrastructure stack, the two areas that are quite compelling to us, one is something like what Red Hat was for Linux needs to exist in this space. If you look at the evolution of the Bitcoin protocol, I think somebody who comes in and can be a services company that can help sort of harden the stacks and get them ready for the commercial use cases, I think there's a big opportunity there, and we're quite interested in that. And I would also say, when you start to think about counterparty verification, what VeriSign was, just to use the internet analogy because that was talked about a lot this morning, so that kind of a trust and verification system needs to exist as well. So I do think these kinds of fundamental infrastructure components need to start to exist before some of these apps will truly thrive, because it's not this is not a deregulated world like what internet was in 1996. There is a big difference from what happened in the evolution of the internet and in an untrusted network versus what needs to happen here in the context of payments.
So when you hear about those better mining gears or slightly more secure exchanges, do you basically say, look, this is kind of interesting, but it's only a 10%, 20% improvement, so come back once you have something really revolutionary? Or is this something that you're tempted because no one has really established themselves as sort of the key leader?
So I think we're super early. No one has established themselves as a key leader. I mean, look at Sapo. We just announced we're investors with some other great funds. And it's the first insured wallet out there. And it makes sense after so many failed exchanges or so many failed systems being hacked over the last 24 months for coins. We're still not even close to having a different place where you can custody and go to sleep with your coins, knowing that somebody's taking care of them, or they're insured, or that who's a trusted party. And it's only been a few weeks. Mm-hmm. So we're still super early in that cycle, and companies like that will have a chance to become the trusted brand.
But once again, that's Wences, an established entrepreneur in the fintech space.
Yeah,
so
that's what it takes.
Mm-hmm. So Jeremy, I didn't mean to cut you off on the adoption, but I actually wanted to get back to it. So the paper was written 4 years ago. It's still very, very early days, and even Coinbase, which seems to have a leading position, announced that they have about 1 million accounts. No one really knows how many of those got funded. No one knows how many of those actually see a transaction.
And to be fair, they have less accounts than blockchain. Mm-hmm. So they are one of the leaders, absolutely. Okay.
So when you guys sort of think about this, when you get a seed company knocking on your door for a Series A, there's barely any adoption. So how do you think about those opportunities, given that they don't really have much to show for in terms of what we call traction?
Yeah, I think the key question to me is what's the problem that you're solving, and I really enjoyed the discussion between Balaji and Mark this morning, but I think that there's a lot of really fun riffing that you can do on what the protocol can support, mm-hmm. but just because the protocol can support it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a fundable business idea. Mm-hmm. I think you've got to start with what's the market.
It was a great big picture. Now let's
super fun, and really interesting and enjoyable. But just because it can be done doesn't mean that it should be done. And so I think a great example is I think Zappo is a terrific example, right? It was a well-known problem that people were losing money in wallets and exchanges. And so that was a very concrete thing that doesn't have a ton to do with technical innovation, right? But as like repackages and puts a bunch of things around it that's solving a business problem that people have. And I much prefer that approach. And so, for instance, I think everybody would agree that the transaction processing, the freeze transactions that Bitcoin allows is a really interesting long-term driver of value. But in the short term, today and probably for the foreseeable future, one of the biggest use cases for Bitcoin is essentially speculation, right? And so that's what led us to the investment in NYBX, which is a pre-launch company. But they said, look, if people are interested in speculating in the Bitcoin price, but they don't actually want to have to hold Bitcoin, they don't want to have to hold the security, the risk of loss of holding Bitcoin.
Do you want to clarify in 30 seconds what they do?
Sure. So what NYBX is doing is building a Bitcoin derivatives exchange. So it allows people to make contracts on what the price of Bitcoin will be in the future, and thereby speculate on the price of Bitcoin in the future. But it gets settled in fiat, right? And it just references a benchmark price. And so that allows people to satisfy a very important use case today, which is the speculation, but without having to hold the Bitcoin, with having the friction of KYC, which is a very important piece of Bitcoin as a transaction processor. But if you're just looking to speculate, so there's no actual money transfer taking place, you can remove that from the system. And so, that was a good example to us of someone thinking about, what's the problem? How are people being able to satisfy that today? It's not being satisfied well by actually buying and holding Bitcoin. And so finding a solution.
But I actually see them, not to spend too much time on that company, but I see them as actually an enabler for e-commerce companies that actually take payments in Bitcoin to hedge themselves against the volatility of Bitcoin. So it's one of the building blocks of moving from...
And that is definitely one of the ways that they can move forward in the future. But I mean, the reality is, you can get that today from, BitPay. BitPay will 100% hedge you against that, volatility. And I think that's just becoming table stakes. There are other companies that are doing transaction processing who are all talking about doing exactly the same thing. And I do think that will be potentially a very important standalone thing in the future. But in the near term, over the next few years, where you see speculation as a core use case, this is a better way to do it than holding Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. So, Hemant, let's talk about as investors, we hate, bad news and unpredictable, sort of markets. And this is a dynamic where we don't know what the regulators are going to do. We don't know how the legal environment is going to change. We have Mt. Gox going bust. We had, the early entrants fighting and suing each other. How do you guys sort of think about that? And what do you tell your LPs, limited partners, people who invest in our funds, about your Bitcoin strategy?
I think Jeff is trying to get somebody to be skeptical on this panel. In our particular, we have a long-term view on this. This is not something where you're going to see highly explosive, value created across a lot of companies in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So the way we think about this is, hey, this is a space that's extremely interesting. It's got a strong value proposition, especially when you think about the value it adds to small and medium businesses. A lot of merchants are starting to experiment with this for a reason. I mean, it can be these fees and the fraud issues and international remittance can be the difference between being able to accept international payments and not being able to sell internationally or not for these merchants, for example. So I think there are early use cases that can be mission critical for businesses. So our view is, look for people that have a long-term view on this. You're not trying to, rush to create, early momentum. You're trying to bring the ecosystem along. And folks that are building businesses with that mindset, that have a long-term view, as all of us are long-term investors here, we sort of say, let's go along for the ride. Let's not look for results in 2-year timeframes, but think sort of 7 to 10-year timeframes. That's what we tell our investors, which is, don't expect us to provide liquidity to our investors in sort of a 3, 4, 5-year time frame in this space, but rather sort of have a 10-year view.
Sorry, you're holding the currency, which is,
And that's something, we're not set up to do that. I mean, if our LPs want to hold currency, they should go buy currency. That's not what we do.
Yeah, I think you might be the only one who actually has the currency in the
Probably.
fund. So how do you sort of sell that or reason that with your investors?
It's, when you're a core focus fund just on financial services and just on consumer financial services, it's very easy. Your investors are trusted me and Nick and Nikolai at Ribbit to go and invest their money. We're looking at financial services. When we wrote a 19-page letter on why we had such a conviction, why we wanted to do this, and we got approval, and we put a position in the fund. So that's how we started getting involved with it early on. Now, just to give you an example here in a question, how many here own Bitcoins? Yeah, more than 50%. How many here work for a bank?
Put your hands up higher.
Yes, because you're going to get asked a lot of questions during the day. So you see, we have, so one of the biggest challenges that the ecosystem has, for as much as the protocol has a lot of potential, the only way to get to millions of users coming in faster is that we still have to work with the financial entities that are out there. There's no other way to get value to move if people cannot have exits into different currencies. So we need more banks. We need more banks participating in this. We need regulators. The Bitcoin Foundation, I'm part of the board of the Bitcoin Foundation. We sort of are out there trying to educate regulators, and the foundation has gone through their own media over the last few weeks too, so it's been on the defensive instead of the offensive. But overall, we're super early. And the day we have here, instead of 10 hands, we have 50 hands, or 75 hands that are from banks. We'll know that some of the businesses that entrepreneurs are trying to build are more feasible. So that's one of the challenges I see short term.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy?
Yeah, and that is not going to happen by itself. I think that active education and lobbying efforts, not just to the various governmental bodies and regulatory bodies, but also directly with financial institutions, by the Bitcoin Foundation, by investors, and by the entrepreneurs in the community is going to be required over the next few years. I don't think that this is going to happen quickly. I totally agree with you. I think that this is going to happen over a fairly lengthy period of time, because trust takes time to build, and that is what's going to be required. I mean, the lack of banks who are willing to take merchant accounts for Bitcoin companies is a real inhibitor for the growth of the ecosystem. And look, that's why I was on the public hearings at for Lawski at NY Department of Financial Services. That's why the Bitcoin Foundation has done a terrific job in making sure that their voices and our voices are being heard in DC and in New York and in Sacramento and in the other places that matter. And I think it's something that we can't assume that someone is going to take care of for us. We all, as investors, as entrepreneurs, as holders of Bitcoin, need to be proactive about.
So what, if you look at, besides the funny letters trying to ban Bitcoins, as you look at what the SEC or the different sort of legislators have said or written about Bitcoin, it's actually not that bad. They don't see it as sort of a completely dark horse. So it's not, what will it take for them to sort of get over the hurdle and start supporting it?
I think they're supporting it. The fact that we have this event and there's 500 people, when last year we did one of these, there were 50, they're supporting it. The news, the signals are all positive. You're not going to have no government in the world is going to put a red carpet and say, here you go, welcome. That's not their role in life. They got a different role, and they're playing it. And the more communication we have, the better. I am much more worried with the established financial ecosystem than I am with the regulators. And I think we have to do more.
Don't you think it's a chicken and egg where the banks will look at the regulators, and if the regulators starts, blessing, they will actually move?
The banks will hide behind the regulators. Doesn't mean that they will listen to the regulators. So there's banks willing to do much more. There's banks willing not to. I don't know, of the entrepreneurs here, how many of you had issues getting a bank to work with you?
Higher.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, bankers, look around. These are the
Help them.
customers. These are the customers that, you know.
So those are, you know, it takes world-class entrepreneurs to get more respect from banks. It takes better funded companies where the VC community is trying to do their part in this. But it's also, you know, it's a much broader effort that needs to happen for that to get there.
I do think it's time and trust. And, you know, there are enough banks and credit unions out there that if, you know, the bank regulators and the credit union regulators explicitly set forth rules that say this is, you know, do this, bright line compliance, that, you know, you will find a bank or a credit union who's willing to take on board, you know, Bitcoin customers. I believe that to be true. There's enough of them out there. I think it's a little while before we get to that bright line regulation, though, and that is, you know, that is just going to take a process of education and a process of trust building. And I think it's easier for a bank to take on board as a customer a company that's founded by, you know, someone who is clearly going to be on the right side of, you know, what the bank wants, that has, you know, trust is transitive. So they will say, like, who's your law firm? Do I trust them? Who are your board members, and do I trust them? Who are your investors, and do I trust them? All the way around, like that transitive property of trust will help the bank get comfortable. And that's where I think that Jeremy Allaire at Circle has done a tremendous job of building, you know, a very trustworthy set of people around them that just makes it easy for a banker to say yes.
That's right. I think all the entrepreneurs in the room, you have to think about making investments in that part of it. I know it's not natural for software and tech entrepreneurs to be thinking about policy and government relations, but this is one of those sectors where you have to get good at it. And I would, you know, figure out what the appropriate level of investment is, and would also collaborate, because it's a consistent mission across all of you. So,
you know, Brian and Fred from Coinbase, a year and a half ago when I met them the first time, they were already talking about banks and talking to banks since the first day they started their business. No coincidence that they are the leader. I mean, they were out there being transparent about it since the first day when ecosystem was still very nascent. And that's what it takes. That's what it takes from the entrepreneur side of this to look for signals that for investors makes also a lot of sense.
It does take time in relationships, so that is the important thing to understand. Like, you cannot convince a bank to work with you by pure force of logic, right? They need to feel comfortable with you. That process of getting comfortable with you does take time. It took time for Coinbase, and it'll take time for other entrepreneurs as well. And then it is relationships. It's looking around at who else is around you, and can they bring their relationships with the banks to bear as well.
And as you guys sort of go and raise your financing, be prepared with all those sort of pretty sharp, slick answers around legal, regulatory environment, and so on and so forth, because unlike traditional, you know, investments we make, we'll spend a lot of time on those. And if we feel that you're not buttoned up, there will be a really good case of passing on the opportunity. So we started hearing about Web 2.0 about 10 years after, you know, the kickoff of the web. We're starting to hear about Bitcoin 2.0 4 years into it. It's about distributed applications, about, you know, program trading. Have you guys sort of looked at some of those opportunities or companies, and what are your thoughts about, you know, already slapping a 2.0 on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I'm still on the 1.0 world. I mean, we don't stop to think. We've had probably one of the worst quarters of news for Bitcoin I could ever put together if you've thought of all the things that could happen. A year ago, every headline in the world started with the phrase, Bitcoin used in Silk Road. That was the money used for illegal drugs. That was the first line that every single news media had a year ago, and I had to spend time explaining to investors that we were not buying illegal drugs.
You have drugs in the fund?
No. And
hardly ever.
And now you look at the headlines; those are not the headlines anymore. they're very different. Every time you start writing the first line of any article on Bitcoin, it's a very different. Now, to think about 2.0, you know, we always, technology-centric people tend to think way ahead of ourselves. And because we understand Bitcoin already, we're already thinking about iterations 5, 6, and 7. At best, in the world, at best, with the most bullish numbers, there are less than 5 million people using Bitcoin. For this to become meaningful, we need to add a couple zeros to this.
Yeah.
And a couple zeros don't come from building 2.0 cases or massive number of different 2.0 cases. They come from building simple user cases. And that's where I think the energy, the capital, the focus, the discipline needs to come back and make sure, let the media say whatever they want to say, but the tech community, the investors, the entrepreneurs, we should focus on building this core infrastructure that will allow it to get there.
You don't get to build applications until the infrastructure is widespread and solid and easy to use, and that's not the case yet.
So we're gonna hand over a few mics to you guys if you want to answer ask questions. But who has paid something in Bitcoin over the last 3 months? Okay, that's an early adopter audience. Because that's really sort of the issue. It's people sort of buy a few Bitcoins, put them in their Coinbase, and then wait, right? And I've made one transaction. I bought something because I wanted to. But it's still very early days for anyone to sort of think about, oh, I actually can do that in Bitcoin. And the most sort of natural use case for me would be international world remittance, where
actually, I want to ask a question. Who's bought something with Bitcoin? Put your hand up really high. Who's bought something with Bitcoin where it was easier to buy with Bitcoin than with cash? Oh, that's and legal. So this is, I would say that this is unusual, right? I'd say that this is unusual today. I'd say that the vast majority of Bitcoin-denominated transactions are driven by novelty rather than by it being a better way. But it appears that we have an outlier audience, and that makes sense at a Bitcoin conference.
You have a good chunk of the early adopters. So who has a burning question for those guys? Mike over there, Pierre?
Yes, hi.
What's up, dude?
My question is, with Aurora Coin's launch yesterday, and I know Spain is looking to do something as well, how does that open up the opportunities as you see them with things like Aurora Coin and again, the other Bitcoin-like currencies?
So we can underestimate the network effect of Bitcoin. I mean, the network effect of developers coming in, of miners putting hardware, processing power, VC money coming in, the media, the amount of centimeters of press and TV airtime that it's getting. Unless, you know, if you combine all the altcoins together, they don't get to 11% of the market cap of Bitcoin in any kind of metric, neither in all of them combined. And now that this is open source, anybody can have their own. So don't underestimate the difficulty of the network effect. And I do think that the only way to this network effect to break, to stop growing, is that the trust is lost. And if trust is lost, I think trust is lost in all cryptocurrencies for a while. Maybe some version 2.0. So I don't think cryptocurrencies are going to go away. They're here to stay. My kids are going to definitely grow up with cryptocurrencies in their lifetime. But the only way that Bitcoin loses is that the trust gets broken. If not, the ecosystem will be built on top of it.
And that is also the power of the open source nature of Bitcoin too. It's like people can identify problems, and a lot of people have said, hey, this alternative coin, you know, fixes this Bitcoin bug, but those bugs are getting fixed, you know, and like over time you're going to see, you know, I think, you know, this is something which I do agree with Mark and Balaji. Like, you can't imagine what the new capabilities are going to be for any, you know, foundational technology 5 or 10 years in advance.
Yeah, I think in general, sort of forking different currencies rather than the ecosystem coming together to make the protocol more sophisticated. This was my point about, you know, if somebody comes in, like a Red Hat-like company for the space that takes on gosh, here's the deficiencies in the context of the use cases that are being asked for today, and harden the existing protocol and build in, you know, reduce the latencies, for example, for transactions and so on. I think that's a better use of time to get this protocol further rather than trying to fork and trying to create awareness and momentum behind different sets of currencies.
We used to say, don't fork. That's the same thing. Over there.
Can you describe one of the use cases that you think the world is really ready for, but that you haven't seen developed yet, and possibly one of the use cases from the 2.0 side of things that you think just shouldn't be developed yet?
Micky, one use case, and then we go on.
The store of value concept, I think, is super powerful. There's 75 countries in the world that it's hard to store value in any of the currencies that we're used to, in any form of factor, and we're not even there. We haven't done great jobs on putting wallets in the hands of those 75 countries. We haven't done a great job building systems within those countries to allow this to happen and to embrace. So that, for me, is the lowest hanging fruit case that I can tell you from the 1.0.
Question here.
Hi, I deal with the cross-border China travel space, and so you've got 200 million Chinese traveling overseas by 2020. Payment has always been an issue, even currently, when they travel, because a lot of them use their Chinese credit cards that aren't accepted wherever they're going. So would love an example of a use case as it applies to travel sector a few years down, or hopefully sooner.
I think that the China-US corridor is actually one of the most interesting ones for that opportunity and for remittance as well. I mean, one of the key challenges for anything to do with currency transfer is that there needs to be a strong local market for fiat to Bitcoin on both ends of the transaction. And so, for instance, a lot of people who've been interested in remittance will talk about the biggest remittance corridors being US to Mexico, for example. But there just isn't enough local demand for Bitcoin in pesos to support a big remittance market between the US and Mexico. But when you look at China and you look at the US, you actually see an example where on both ends you've got robust demand in fiat on both sides for Bitcoin, and that does allow these sorts of opportunities.
Question in the back?
So I hear a lot about trust. You talk a lot about trust in Bitcoin companies. And this is something I'm actually working on with my company. I just want to hear your thoughts on the potential of having something like an S&P 500 or Moody's ratings type system for Bitcoin companies, and if that would help banks feel more comfortable getting involved.
I think that the answer is that a rating is only as reputable as the rating agency, and so that's one of the challenges with startup rating agencies is they don't have any history of being good at predicting things. So I think that there will be a lot of value in that concept over time, but it'll be a while before people start to trust the rating agency. Like, you got to call stuff right for a while before people trust you.
The question is, who can you work with in order to get their credibility assigned to you as you build your own ratings? Over there, and then we'll have one in the front.
Can you each name 3 companies that you think will be billion-dollar Bitcoin companies? Just not Coinbase or any of the ones we already know, but 3 kind of stealthy ones.
I didn't understand the question.
The question is, name which of your companies will be sort of billion-dollar companies. I think we don't know at this point, right? Yeah. So I'll pass on that question. Next.
If you know any, let us know.
Here's a mic.
Hi, I'm working on a project where I need very tiny transaction fees. And, what do you see, and what are you aware of in the development of micropayments that are truly micro, like nano payments? Because that's what's going to make my application succeed.
Nano payments?
I think micropayments is an interesting use case. I do think that is something, because of the structure of just the credit card fees, like on the internet, you really haven't been able to create those kinds of business models as successfully. I also think you could use micropayments as a vehicle for eliminating things like spam. You could have very tiny fractions of Bitcoin, payments that spammers will not, it won't be economical for them to be able to do. So I do think the fact that there's fractional use case of currency can start to be implemented with Bitcoin. So we are looking for ideas in that area.
Right now, the only practical way to do that is off-chain. That's one of the key issues, which requires a sort of vertical integration across wallets. And so, just because of the way that it has to be off-chain today. That may not always be the case. I hope that's not always the case. I think it would be much better for the system if that's not always the case. But that limits the number of people that you can work with.
We're done, guys. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you. Good luck with your Bitcoin startups. Good luck, Premier, with the summit. And thank you, Micky, Jeremy, and Hemant.
Thank you.